So to help lead us into today, I'm very honored to have Dr. Jared Staudt. He's the assistant, or this is the old bio. He is now in now at the Archdiocese in Denver. He earned his BA and MA in Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas and his PhD in Systematic Theology at UMary University, writing his dissertation on the virtue of religion in St. Thomas Aquinas. He taught previously, or he continues to teach at the Augustine Institute, and has served also as Director of Religious Education for a parish there. He has written scholarly articles on the thought of Aquinas, Christopher Dawson, Pope Benedict XVI, Pope John Paul II, and writes regularly for several Catholic periodicals. His main interest is on the relationship of faith and culture, including the role of culture in evangelization. He is married to an alumnus of St. Thomas Catholic Studies program, and they have 5 beautiful children. So please, 6 beautiful children. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jared Staudt.
So I'm speaking on a theology of the land, and I was talking about my talk last night at dinner with some students, and one of them said, "Is there such a thing as a theology of the land?" Well, yes, I'm going to try to show that there is. And I always tell my students when they're writing papers that it's better to say a lot about a little than a little about a lot. Well, I'm going to try to say a little about a very broad topic as I trace the land through salvation history in the Bible. Walter Brueggemann said that he thought that land was the central theme in the Bible. I think that's an exaggeration, but I do think it's a very important theme. And so I'm going to look at land in the Bible, in the life of the church, and Catholic social teaching. And I doubt I'll have enough time, but I hope to have some time to make a few reflections on the relationship of land to the new evangelization. But I first want to ask, what is the purpose of land? Why should we even care about land? Well, I think it provides for humanity just the basics of sustenance, security, a sense of place and belonging, independence, freedom to worship, especially for Israel, and it constitutes a blessing from God, a gift from God, as Wendell Berry would say. So, as I begin to just then reflect on salvation history, we want to look at the beginning. Right, let's turn back to the beginning. And we see in both creation stories that land plays a central role. In the first story, man and woman are given dominion over the earth and its works. While in the second creation story, land factors centrally into the identity, mission, and even destiny of Adam. Adam, literally meaning red, comes from the Adamah, dirt, or red dirt, more specifically. That he comes forth from the earth makes clear that man's body did not come from nothing, but from a pre-existing material substance. Dirt demonstrates Adam's rootedness and dependence on the soil, but also his fragility as being destined for death, as Joseph Ratzinger said, commenting on Genesis 2. Man is no angel, but comes from the earth, lives in dependence on it, as he is given a task to till and keep it, and he will return to it as dust. Sin ruptures the harmony of man and the soil, which was meant to be complementary, which man must then overcome through work. Moving forward in salvation history, we see how the account of Noah introduces a key theme to the Old Testament. The land itself can become polluted by sin, but God can also restore it and renew his people. A particular strip of this renewed earth after the flood constitutes a key promise to the descendant of Shem, Shem being Noah's son, Abraham. Abram, as he's first known, must give up any claim to his own home and family to receive the gift of land that God wants to make to him. When he says to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you." Abraham's faith in this promise, "To your descendants I will give this land," after he arrives, embodies a fundamental tenet of Israel's existence. Stephen Dempster, a biblical scholar, describes how, quote, God's promise of land is a fact central to Israel's faith. Israel's faith is anything but a disembodied spirituality. It is rooted in dirt and soil, in the Adamah, end quote. As the story unfolds, however, taking possession of this land proves long, difficult, incomplete, and fragile. We find in Exodus that Israel, having settled in a foreign land, Egypt, suffers under oppression and cannot offer worship to God. God calls them out of Egypt specifically to offer sacrifice and gives them the land only after the encounter with him at Sinai. He says that he wants them to leave Egypt to hold a feast to me in the wilderness. In fact, the encounter with God at Sinai, this feast, proves fundamental for understanding the Holy Land as the land given to Israel by God as a sanctuary for serving him. Dempster explains how the goal of the journey out of Egypt is to relocate Israel in the land of promise. The goal of Exodus is thus the building of the Edenic sanctuary so that the Lord can dwell with his people. End quote. Though through Joshua, Israel takes possession of the land, and its tribes and families are given their allotment to pass down as an inheritance. God makes clear to his people, however, that Israel does not possess the land outright, but it remains the possession of God to be cared for according to his instructions. God directs a Sabbath rest for the land every 7 years and a restoration of ancestral plots every 50 after a Sabbath of Sabbath years. Private ownership gives way in the Sabbath year to the land's use for the common good. Quote, "For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the wild beasts may eat." End quote. That's Exodus 23. Israel does not respect this Sabbath for the land, and its people follow the prior inhabitants in polluting it with their sins. Israel's holiness should reverberate to the land itself, but instead it defiles the land. The land cannot serve as the sanctuary God wants it to be. This holiness should radiate from the epicenter of the Holy of Holies through Israel, through the Israelites, to permeate the entire land. Rather, Jeremiah tells Israel, "You have polluted the land with your vile harlotry." God warned Israel of the potential loss of land, saying to Solomon that if his people did not keep the commandments, then he would cut off Israel from the land. That's in 1 Kings 9. When this happens in the exile, God kept the land desolate to enjoy its missing Sabbaths for 70 years. The land returned to chaos, necessitating not only a new exodus, bringing the people back to the land, but even a new creation. Removing his people from land entailed a call to conversion, as the land, a sign of Israel's covenant with God, must give way before God's own presence. Ezekiel and Jeremiah both point to the need for a spiritual renewal and even a new covenant, a new way of understanding Israel's relationship with God that is not based on material possession. But this does not mean that the land has been removed from God's plan for his people. According to the prophets, the coming of the Messiah would restore the land even to an Edenic paradise, as we see in Isaiah 11. Where the wolf lies down with the lamb, etc. Joel 3:18 states, "And in that day the mountains shall drip sweet wine, and the hills shall flow with milk." And yet, when Jesus comes, he does not physically enact this restoration, but speaks of the destruction of the temple, the dwelling place of God in the land. The new Joshua, right? Jesus is Joshua in Greek, opens a new holy land to Israel, an inheritance described as a new heaven and a new earth in the book of Revelation. In the meantime, the new Israel will sojourn, and creation will continue to groan, awaiting its restoration, as Paul describes in Romans 8. The earth retains its importance for sustaining human life, And even in the new creation, there will be a restoration of the land, a place for the just to dwell with God forever. Okay, so there's the first part of this ridiculous survey of land, in Catholic thought. So I want to turn now to Christian identity in the land, so land in the life of the church. Christians recognize in Christ, the Messiah, the awaited King of Israel and the nations. Psalm 2 speaks of God setting up his king on Mount Zion, telling him, "Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession." Jesus reigns at the right hand of the Father, and the church exercises his dominion over the earth, but not in the way expected, and not by setting up an earthly dwelling for the Lord. In fact, Jesus rejects the temptation of earthly kingdoms offered to him by Satan in Matthew 4:8. The earliest Christians seem to recognize that an important shift had occurred, and that the reign of the Messiah would not come through an allotment of land. Rather, and we see in Acts 4, as many as were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid at the apostles' feet, and distribution was made to each as any had need. These first Jewish believers disposed of their ancestral allotment of land, forsaking the Holy Land as the dwelling place of God, and receiving the Holy Spirit within their bodies as the new temple. The selling of this land and placing the proceeds at the feet of the apostles had an unexpected consequence, however. The church became, at that moment, a custodian of earthly goods. Therefore, the church rests in between the claim to possess the land as a blessing from God and the expectation of a new heaven and a new earth. The church does not claim for itself the possession of a particular land as its inheritance, but it would become the largest landowner in Europe and remains one of the largest landowners in the world today. The custom of selling land, or even more so donating it outright, arose in order to care for the poor and for performing acts of charity. Nonetheless, these lands became mass holdings, and though they endowed the church's ministry, they would become an end in themselves for many servants of the church, and especially for the Pope, who did acquire his own earthly dominion. In the context of this vast survey, I will provide a few illustrations of how the church acquired and made use of land. The church acquired some property in the first centuries, but this could be and was seized many times, so that donated property would be sold or held in the name of individuals. The ability of the church to own land changed through the influence of Constantine, who himself donated property to the church, first in the Lateran estate, restored land seized during persecution, and enacted laws favoring property inheritance by the church, as recorded by Eusebius. We also see in the rule of St. Benedict that even in the monastic community, the community most directly imitating Acts 4, how the monastery acquired land. In chapter 58, Benedict describes how the postulant, quote, if he has any property, should first either dispose of it to the poor or bestow it on the monastery by a formal donation. Likewise, in chapter 59, when wealthy families offer their children as oblates to the monastery, which is no longer permitted, so parents don't get any ideas, they can also make a donation of land. And the monks from these donations and inherited properties took lands many viewed, in Newman's words, as desolate waste, and drained swamps, raised churches, and formed schools. From the letters of Pope St. Gregory the Great, we also know that the early popes received large landholdings and what they did with them. It's amazing how frequently, actually, he talks about these properties in his letters. Gregory used his own personal holdings in Rome and Sicily to found monasteries, and he saw the Roman Church's possessions, even outside of Italy, in Dalmatia and Provence, as belonging to the poor, in his words. Gregory also directed bishops in his letters on how to treat those living and working on church lands, how to manage the property, and he even directed them about collecting taxes. In fact, Benjamin Weicker claims that in these early donations, we find the roots of the Papal States. On the lands given to the church, bishops played a role in the transition from Roman slavery to a servile but landed peasantry. A 7th century will from a Bishop Bertrand in Gaul freed slaves and refers to them as making use of their own land holdings, which he says they should increase through hard work. His will gives witness to a larger trend. After the fall of Rome, Christians transitioned from the Roman villas manned with slaves, referred to as villa rustica, to families of coloni settled on small farms. The system spread of these coloni as small holdings increased in number. This was an intermediary state between servitude and complete freedom, where the coloni were not all freeholders, and though many of them were still even in a condition of slavery, all in fact lived on the land they farmed, and without actually owning it, thought of it as their land and handed it down to their children. These holdings laid the foundation for the manorial system, where the lord held the domain, comprising up to half of the total land of the estate, and the peasant and lord shared certain lands in common for grazing. Like ancient Israel, there was no outright ownership of the land, but only inherited rights of property use. The king actually held all of the land in the name of the people, and each of his vassals were given an allotment of land, and in turn then had dependents who had property rights. As the Middle Ages progressed, this fixed system of tenancy of penance, holding manse, with various levels of freedom, transitioned to a hereditary tenancy based on fixed negotiable payments of the produce of the land. Land holdings became the basis for the support of the church's ministry in the form of benefices, arising from the rents of lands she possessed. These benefices enabled the church to care for her ministers, but they presented many opportunities for abuse. Clerics seeking multiple or large benefices, absentee pastors receiving the revenue from a benefice while paying a vicar to perform his work, and that's where you even get the word parochial vicar, right? Somebody who's taking the place of the pastor in his work. And the placing of nobility into choice positions to reap the financial benefits. Land, therefore, became an obstacle in the church's ministry. Many popes focused more on the acquisition and governing of lands and on taxation across Europe than on the spiritual state of the church. The mendicants, like the Franciscans and Dominicans, refusal to possess land to endow their orders, at least until the Council of Trent, bore witness against this obstacle and even scandal. By the end of the Middle Ages, the church had accumulated an unbalanced amount of land, up to half of all the land in England and parts of Germany, posing not only a spiritual obstacle, but an economic and political challenge that inspired the Reformation and later played into the French Revolution. The sudden dispossession of the church's land in the modern period created a gap in the care for the poor and other charitable works, with the pool of wealth that had been set aside for charitable purposes falling into private hands. Okay, so there is the vast overview of land in the church's history. But now I'd like to transition into the rise of Catholic social teaching and how the transition from the church being a vast landholder and also the breakdown of the feudal system of the families holding hereditary lands played into the concerns that gave rise to Catholic social teaching itself. Catholic social teaching arose in a context when not only the church suffered the loss of property, but much of the rural population abandoned farming and migrated to the city. A number of factors contributed to the loss of agricultural lands: the closing of the commons, the rise of industrialization, and the changing of inheritance laws. French conservatives stood at the forefront of the Catholic response to this social transition. Louis de Bonald, for instance, attacking laws first initiated by the French Revolution, claimed that, quote, the equality of inheritance strikes a mortal blow to property, in part because it destabilizes the family. That property would not be kept in the name of the family, but would have to be dispersed in equal parts to the members of the family. And he says, farther, the agricultural family is fixed, the industrial family is mobile. Frederic Laplace critiqued what he saw as financial material progress at the cost of upending the family from its traditional economic and social stability, with the resulting decline in moral and religious life. Émile Keller spoke of, quote, the diminution of family property by the reconstitution of large capital properties and the ruin of small patrimonies. Yet, he asserted farther, the small farm is that sacred nursery of the independent man. Keller's work, in particular at the close of the 19th century, brings us into the context from which Leo XIII first spoke of the social question in 1891 with Rerum Novarum. The ownership of property and its relation to the stability of the family constitute essential themes in Leo's encyclical. Opposing socialism's intended solution of collectivization, Leo asserts that, quote, it is surely undeniable that when a man engages in remunerative labor, the impelling reason and motive of his work is to obtain property, and therefore to hold it as his very own. Thus, if he lives sparingly, saves money, and for greater security invests his savings in the land in such case is only his wages under another form, and consequently a working man's little estate, thus purchased, should be as completely at his full disposal as are the wages he receives for this labor. But it is precisely in such power of disposal that ownership obtains, whether the property consists of land or chattels. End quote. This right extends all the more, quote, to a man in his capacity of head of a family. Nay, that right is all the stronger in proportion as the human person receives a wider extension in the family group. End quote. A father's ownership should extend to productive property and be inheritable by his children. Thus, Leo placed estrangement from the land as productive property at the heart of the Church's new social doctrine. Leo's emphasis may seem tied to the specific social concerns of the late 19th century, but the role of land in Catholic social teaching was reaffirmed by subsequent popes and continues in a distinct way even in recent magisterial texts. The strongest reaffirmation came from Pope Pius XII, commemorating the 50th anniversary of Rerum in a radio address on June 1st, 1941, entitled La Solennità della Pentecoste. Pius describes Leo's vision of the key connection of the family in land. Quote, of all the goods that can be the object of private property, none is more conformable to nature, according to the teaching of Rerum Novarum, than the land, the holding in which the family lives, and from the products of which it draws all or part of its subsistence. And it is in the spirit of Rerum Novarum to state that, as a rule, only that stability which is rooted in one's own holdings makes the family the most vital and most perfect and fecund cell of society, joining up in a brilliant manner in its progressive cohesion the present and future generations. End quote. Pius recognizes the difficulty of this position in the 20th century under new economic conditions, but asks how we could not, quote, think of the vital space of the family and free it of the fetters of conditions which do not permit it even to formulate the idea of a homestead of one's own. End quote. Jumping ahead to the 100th anniversary of Rerum, marked by the aptly named Centesimus Annus, John Paul II does not insist on the importance of land for family life, but after recognizing this as Leo's position, he affirms, quote, the right to possess the things necessary for one's personal development and the development of one's family, whatever the concrete form by which that right may assume. So he's building on Leo's understanding of the land, but extending that to other forms of property. Later in the encyclical, he acknowledges that, quote, in history, these two factors, work and the land, are to be found at the beginning of every human society, end quote. Though he recognizes that work has shifted much more to the intellectual sphere, he nonetheless calls workers to, quote, become more knowledgeable of the productive potentialities of the earth and more profoundly cognizant of the needs of those for whom their work is done, end quote. Work should attend more closely to the land and its purpose to serve the common good. The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, published in 2004, does not address the topic of land extensively. It does, however, speak strongly against land ownership being concentrated in the hands of a few, especially in developing countries, and asserts that an equitable distribution of land remains ever critical. Pope Francis's Laudato Si on the care for our common home, the environment, hits on similar themes. For instance, in paragraph 94, he quotes the bishops of Paraguay, quote, "Every campesino," kind of the peasant of Latin America, "has a natural right to possess a reasonable allotment of land where he can establish his home, work for subsistence of his family, and a secure life. This right must be guaranteed so that its exercise is not illusory but real." In paragraph 146, he also speaks of the crisis of indigenous people losing their native lands, and he notes that, quote, "land is not a commodity, but rather a gift from God, a sacred space with which they need to interact if they are to maintain their identities and values." And he also applies this to the West, encouraging our liberation from the dominant technocratic paradigm, and he encourages small cooperatives when they adopt less polluting means of production and opt for a non-consumerist model of life, recreation, and community. So Francis, I think, shows us how land in its right use continue to play an important role in Catholic social teaching. I have just a few minutes just to conclude then with my last section on land in the new evangelization. And what I want to reflect on here is that in light of where we stand at our culture presently, land, I think, is, unlike maybe Chesterton and Belloc's approach, is not going to be central in economic reforms, trying to actually get each family an allotment of land, right? Which is what distributism, the model of Chesterton and Belloc drawing on Rerum Novarum, promotes. But rather that both, I think, Pope Francis and Pope Benedict see contact with the land as important for spiritual refreshment. So, for instance, Pope Benedict says, "Nor must we forget the very significant fact that many people experience peace and tranquility, renewal and reinvigoration when they come into close contact with the beauty and harmony of nature." And so I'm just going to skip over some things here, but I think one particular figure, maybe unlike Chesterton and Belloc, which I think is still very relevant, is the co-founder of the Catholic worker movement, Peter Maurin. And Maurin, we know him and Dorothy Day more for their work in establishing houses of hospitality and for their newspaper. But Peter actually was most interested in establishing Catholic worker farms. And so I just want to read a little bit about this vision of Maurin, where he basically wanted to work towards a society where it was easier for men to be good, and for people to come to the farms and to learn how to work again, and to learn the beauty and dignity of work. And he was inspired by the monks. But Dorothy Day, describes this vision, writing for the Catholic Worker, and describes this vision as an agronomic university. And so she speaks of it that this idea is meant to foster one's spiritual life and to deepen the spiritual life, and to show how life in Christ can be achieved by realizing the faith and response to the needs and opportunities of our everyday occupations. The idea of work, the land, people's needs. The study of what others are doing, the lives of great Christians. A sharing, in other words, with each other in love and work, thought and worship. All of this will be part of the life here on our beginnings of an agronomic university. And although that's kind of an awkward phrase, the agronomic university, really I think what they were trying to do is to bring families to the land, to work on the land in common, and to share ideas and to be spiritually refreshed. So I think that is still a very compelling model. And in light of this, like I said, this vast survey, I think it's important to recognize how we have become estranged from any organic contact with the land. And, looking back at Genesis, right, we literally have arisen from the land, and God has given all of us this mission to care for the land, to exercise dominion over it. And so in the context of the church's mission for evangelization, I think we have to help people to recover a sense of a fuller humanity. Right? Grace builds on nature. And in so many ways today, nature is being undermined. So I just want to end then with a quote from Pope Francis, where we're literally looking back to the beginning. And he says that the commands given to Adam in the garden apply to every single human being. And so he says, cultivating and caring for creation is an instruction of God, which he gave not only at the beginning of history, but has also given to each one of us. It is a part of his plan, right? And that's why he went through the story of salvation history. The plan continues with us today. It means making the world increase with responsibility, transforming it so that it may be a garden, an habitable place for all of us. So essentially what I'm just trying to show us is that we need to be more attentive to the land. And Francis says in Laudato Si, right, that, and this is pretty obvious, and Wendell Berry has pointed us to this as well, that our fate is bound up with the fate of the land. And so that we need to attend to the land as part of our own culture and the health of our own society, and personally of our own humanity. So thank you.